shit regardless.
As an economic principle, it seems like the Fed also is a way that maybe the elite use it to transfer wealth as opposed and control, as opposed to really trying to free the system. Whereas as Austrian kind of, I guess, as you said, leads to more free market. I mean, is there a big difference between like free and captured controlled in those two systems?
Absolutely. So the way most Austrian economists would view what's gone on over this last century or so is essentially that the state keeps expanding, and that what happens, and this is where it gets a little bit more confusing, because when people look at what we've had, they say, oh, look, the big businesses are in bed with the government.
Mm-hmm.
And in some sense, Austrians agree with that, because they're saying what we want really is less government intervention. But really what happens in practice nowadays is more like big business will lobby with the government, and the incentives just kind of work for them to try to set up a system that cocoons themselves from outside competition. And so even things like, the Federal Reserve and so on, it often ends up being that the existing big players, once they've gotten big, they try to lobby the government, and they will try to say, hey, and they might couch it in very noble sounding language. They might say like, oh, look, it would be very unsafe to not have regulation on this industry. So let's have regulation on this industry. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to make the regulation kind of fit just around me and make a nice little cocoon around me so that I can entrench myself against new competitors.
Yeah.
And in some sense, that happens in many industries, and banking is just one of them.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like regulations are always meant to kind of entrench those positions. I've seen it firsthand. I was really involved in the early days of the internet, and I remember, I forget what it was called now. All these bills, they're bad, but they have these good sounding names. And it was a bill that Amazon had put forth saying that in the United States, if you were selling products online, you didn't have to collect sales tax to every single jurisdiction that you were selling to. There'd be no way to do that. And so they put this bill, and it was like the Fair Tax Collection Act or something like that. And of course, Amazon is the one that pushed it. And they said everyone had to start collecting tax. But of course, the small guy, there's no way they could do that. Only Amazon could do that. And so we see that kind of thing happen all the time. But it seems like we've moved now to where everybody wants to have like this free, or I should say this risk-free, this safe society where everybody succeeds. And Austrian is kind of like, it's free, but it's not safe. And so I think it looks like you kind of have to have this trade-offs. And it seems like more people are opting for safety over freedom at this point. Is that what you're seeing?
Absolutely. And I'm certainly in the camp where, I guess, put simply, yeah, I value freedom over safetyism, if you will. Now, I think the irony is, though, is that those people who were saying safetyism people are almost in some way, without realizing, they are jeopardizing their long-term safety anyway.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas I think if we were to have that society that prioritized freedom, and in this case, more specifically, private property rights and our rights, I think we would actually, in some kind of counterintuitive way, we would actually make society more prosperous and more safe anyway. It's just that what happens is government becomes this kind of big bureaucracy. It starts to impose one size fits all rules on everyone. It becomes onerous. It becomes high tax. And so those of us who want freedom, and it's a weird thing, because it's almost like the views that maybe you and I are talking about now, they might be perhaps in the minority now, but say 100 years ago, they probably weren't in that much of a minority. It's just that over time, the values, the culture of society, whether in the US or here in Australia or elsewhere around the world, it's like the values have eroded in some way. And so it's a tricky situation, but I think there is kind of like maybe there is a bit of a pendulum sort of swing aspect to this. And I think to some extent we're seeing the pendulum kind of go to the one end, and I think now we're gonna eventually it'll come back the other way.
There's a book called The Pendulum. That's a great book. I don't know if you were just saying that or if you've heard of the book.
I haven't, no.
But it basically talks about, it's called The Pendulum, and it talks about these 40-year swings where we go from a we cycle. So that's we collectivism, globalism, and then it swings to a me cycle, which is individualism, decentralization. And so every 40 years it goes, so it's an 80-year cycle back and forth. And the last time when we shifted from the decentralized, the me, was at the end of like World War II, which is when the UN got founded, the EU first started getting founded, all those things. And right now, I think 2021 is the peak of that we cycle. And then it starts to shift back to a me, individualism, decentralization cycle. And in the book, they trace it back thousands of years. It's pretty interesting.